To wake on a day like today, isn't it? What happened to your robe? You're the only one who made it. You didn't get the email, they all decided to skip. Good. Excuse me. We've had so much rain lately, I'm surprised we all don't have gills. All righty, on Monday, I was talking about the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and the fact that he's going to be the first American president to really act like a world leader, to be a player in world affairs. Most of the progressives were more interested in solving domestic problems, not world problems. They wanted to make the United States, much like the Puritans back in the 17th century, a beacon on a hill, an example for the rest of the world. But they didn't necessarily want to interfere with the rest of the world. But some of the progressives, and this is kind of an oxymoron, were also imperialists. And TR was an imperialist and believed the United States needed to project power. And by the way, the other great progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, he's also going to be extremely interested in world affairs. Good morning. Good morning. He'll be the first president to act this way for several factors. As I pointed out, he's already an ardent imperialist. Remember Alfred Thayer Mahan, the naval strategist? Roosevelt believes deeply in what Mahan teaches. So the United States needs to be not just a great industrial power, but a great military power. Secondly, he believes the U.S. is competing not only with Great Britain and France, the two established great powers, but we're also competing with the rising powers in the world, Germany, Japan, and Italy. All those countries sound familiar. Yeah, they're all the same players in two world wars, aren't they? Go figure. And Teddy's a social Darwinist. He believes the American people, at least the ones from Northern Europe, were superior to lesser races. He actually believed that people from Northern Europe, England, Belgium, France, Germany, places like that, might have a special gene that made them more adaptive to democracy. He tended to look down on third world peoples and even Southern Europeans, which unfortunately a lot of Americans did back then. The quest to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama is probably a good example to illustrate both Teddy's vision in foreign affairs and his social Darwinist attitude towards others. Now, canal through the isthmus right here has always been an American dream. We've got two long coastlines, and to get from one to the other, you have to sail all the way around South America. It's a lengthy voyage, obviously. Good morning. canal would cut that trip by about 70%. And we have long wanted one. Actually, we weren't the only ones. The first attempt to build a canal across Panama was done by the French, by the same guy that built the Suez Canal. But there were other obstacles in Panama, so they never got it completed. Teddy wants to build that canal. And the United States begins negotiating with Colombia. Back then, Panama was owned by the nation of Colombia. The talks reach an impasse. The big issue is who's going to control the canal. Is it going to be the United States or Colombia? Colombia felt that it's going to be across their territory. They should own it. By the way, there is a precedent for that. When the British, when the French, when the U.S. government paid off the Colombian soldiers garrisoning the capital of Panama back then, Colón. They paid them $50 each to surrender. How's that for a revolution? So the Panamanian Revolution's a huge success after about 4 hours. And showing how friendly and helpful we are, we just happen to have a new constitution written for Panama. Wasn't that nice of us? And it also happened to include a section giving the United States complete control over the canal. What a coincidence. Sign on the dotted line, thank you, okay. And the American-backed government in Panama gives Roosevelt what he wants. So he basically creates a revolution and seizes it. And we do pay the new government of Panama $10 million for the rights to build the canal. And work begins in 1904. If anything, it marks the rise of American industry and engineering. We do something that nobody else was capable of doing. What are the two big problems we had to overcome in digging that canal? Well, there's a lot of dirt in the way. No, that's not it. No.
Make room?
Please? No, you're thinking that's good, but that's not the reason, but,
There's someone who would
yeah, no.
Didn't have to do with the water level?
Oh, way to go, thank you, yeah. Unlike when they were digging the Suez Canal, that area is flat. If you've ever been there, it's desert, it's flat basically. It's not that hard to dig a canal through there. Panama is hilly and mountainous. It actually goes uphill towards the interior. And if you know anything about science, water doesn't flow uphill, does it? So how do you overcome that problem? How do they overcome the problem?
You said, did you say, don't say they dug it out? When they have to?
Oh, they couldn't dig through an entire mountain,
It graded,
no. No.
I wanted to watch it on Netflix, I saw that, but, they probably wouldn't know.
How do they overcome it? They use an old trick, something we used here for a long time on the canal systems, and the British used it. You use locks. If you want to go uphill, you sail the ship into the lock, you close it up, then you flood the lock, and it raises it up to the next level. Then you open the gate, and sails into the next level. And then you do the same thing. You raise the water level in that, takes it up to the top. Then they created a huge lake in the middle, and all you do is sail across that lake, and then when you get to the other side, you sail into a lock, and they lower the water. You sail into the next lock, they lower the water. So that's how they do it. It's sort of like an elevator, but it's a lock system. It was ingenious, and they still use it. They've expanded it, but they still use it. What's the other problem they have to overcome?
Is it disease?
Very good, thank you. Yeah, malaria, yellow fever. And unlike the earlier French, the United States goes out of the way to eradicate these diseases in the area and protect all the workers. Most of the men who built the canal were actually from the West Indies and from Panama. The only Americans involved tended to be the engineers and construction managers and people like that. The actual laborers tended to be West Indian or Panamanian. And the U.S. government went out of their way to make sure they were healthy, provided good food and pay, and they got it done. The canal opens 10 years later in August of 1914. And by the way, why is that kind of fortuitous? What else happens in August of 1914? Wasn't my birthday. Was born in August, not 1914. World War I breaks out. That canal's going to come in handy when we get in that war, big time. Roosevelt, by the way, that's a picture of him. That's TR right here in the crane. He was so enthusiastic about it, in 1906, he decided to go down there and see how it was going. And inadvertently, he made history. He became the first sitting president of the United States to leave the country while president. The first one in American history. It's an unofficial visit, though. The first one to actually on a state visit will be Woodrow Wilson. But he's the first one to actually leave the country as president. Now it's really complex, isn't it? Every president is part of the job. That same year as the canal, Roosevelt announces a corollary, which is simply an amendment, to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, back in the 1820s, the United States had set itself up as the protector of the Americas. Good morning, how are you? We couldn't enforce it. The British actually enforced it throughout much of the 19th century. Roosevelt, 1904, adds the so-called Roosevelt Corollary. We're not only going to protect the Americas from foreign aggression, we're going to police them. We're going to keep everybody in order. So we're giving ourselves the right to basically arbitrate problems in this hemisphere. And to some degree, he was responding to German attempts to gain influence in South America, Venezuela. Gee, where have I heard that name before? It's been in the news lately, hasn't it? In the news a lot. But Venezuela had basically reneged on its foreign debt. It owed Germany, millions of dollars. And the Germans were going to use that as an excuse to maybe colonize it. Nothing ever came of it. They arbitrated a decision on money and all that. But Roosevelt was trying to keep foreign influence out. Still, it's very imperialistic, making ourselves a policeman. The corollary, though, had the unofficial support of a nation we were growing much friendlier towards and will eventually be allied with. The old mother country, Great Britain. The United States and Britain, increasingly, our concerns and interests were dovetailing. We're becoming alike. So a lot of the old animosity towards the British was finally beginning to fade in this country. Today, they're our greatest ally. So it's hard to imagine back in the 1880s, 1890s, a whole lot of Americans basically hated them, didn't trust them. He also promulgated it to protect American business interests. American business was heavily invested in Latin America. We owned approximately 43% of all the industries in Mexico back then. We were heavily invested in other Latin American countries. So the Roosevelt Corollary, in many ways, was also done to help protect American economic interests in South America. And here's a contemporary cartoon of Roosevelt as world police. By the way, notice the size of his billy club. Anybody remember or know what Roosevelt's famous statement was on world policy for the United States? Yes, ma'am.
Speak softly and carry a big stick.
Thank you. It's an old African proverb. It was, speak softly and carry a big stick, which, by the way, isn't bad advice, is it? That's why the oversized billy club. And the other thing I want to point out, and it might be difficult for you guys to see at this point. If I make it too dark in here, everybody's going to take a nap. It's not the weather we have today. But this is a lot better. Notice how the Europeans were portrayed, and then notice how the Latin Americans are portrayed. It's rather racist, isn't it?
What's the cop? Is that like an American cop? Police officer?
Yeah, he's dressed like a cop.
New Yorkers?
Anyway, I just wanted to show you that cartoon. To illustrate America's growing strength as a military power. Oh, I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. One other aspect of the Roosevelt Corollary, we're going to get involved in a series of wars in Central America to preserve American interest. Many of them on behalf of the United Fruit Company, which basically had a monopoly on bananas in the United States. We will fight wars in Nicaragua, Honduras, Cuba, Haiti. Collectively, these wars will be dubbed the Banana Wars. And they're fought roughly from about 1900 up through the mid-1920s. And by the way, the Marines are involved in a ton of them.
Every one of them almost.
Yeah. Are you familiar with them?
Couple of them.
A couple of them, yeah. Marines learned a lot from them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Real sure.
When we get to Vietnam on the Small Wars Manual, I'll bring that up.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at any rate, folks, it involves the United States in a lot of these little wars. And we weren't doing it for the benefit of the people down there, we were doing it for the benefit of American business. Now, as I pointed out, Roosevelt believes the United States should be a great military power. And he wanted to show the world our growing strength. And again, I don't know what's wrong with me today, I just got ahead of myself. Forgot one other thing. I apologize, I don't know why I'm so disjointed today. While we were involved in getting the canal, in February of 1904, and it ends in September of 1905, a war breaks out in the North Pacific between Russia and the growing empire of Japan. And it's conveniently known as the Russo-Japanese War. Now, if there was a Vegas odds maker back then, the money would have been on Russia. It was an established world power. They were didn't work out that way. Several humiliating battles and 2 sunken fleets later, the Russians had been defeated. The Japanese had won a huge victory over them. Now, both countries, by mid-1905, had good reason for wanting to get out of that war. Russia wanted to get out because the war had sparked internal revolution. The Tsar was afraid he'd lose his throne and possibly his head. Which, by the way, 12 years later, guess what happens to him? Yep, he loses his throne and his head in another revolution. So he wants to get out of the war so they don't lose anymore, and also because he's afraid of revolution that's breaking out. The Japanese want to get out of the war because they realize that as good as they are, they had also been extremely lucky. And if you look at a map, sorry, I have to keep using this thing today. Here's Russia, basically, and here's Japan right down here. If Russia gears up, they can eventually crush Japan. They're much larger, much more powerful. So Japan wants to get out, keep some of the goodies they had already won from the war. And guess who ends up arbitrating a peace treaty for the war? Theodore Roosevelt. Both nations agree, and both send delegates to TR's summer home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And both nations underestimated TR. They both had accepted the deal because they thought they could manipulate him. They thought he was naive. And he actually turned the negotiations, even though we were not involved in the war. The settlement ends up favoring the United States more than it favors either of the 2 players. So somebody got snookered there, and it wasn't TR. And on the 5th of September, 1905, they agreed to the Treaty of Portsmouth, ending the Russo-Japanese War. Kind of ironic that a war that began in the North Pacific ends in a parlor in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. By the way, TR's summer home was a mansion, so staying there was not exactly an onerous job for the people negotiating. Here's part of the negotiations. The Russians look worried and the Japanese look a bit smug. Now, the treaty's favorable to the Japanese, but then again, they won the war, and they got what they wanted out of it to some degree. But they didn't get everything. And TR managed to preserve a balance of power in the North Pacific, which is what he wanted to do. He didn't want either Russia or Japan to be too strong to be able to challenge us. And that's kind of what he engineered at Portsmouth. So you got to give him a lot of credit. He does end the war. He does come up with an honorable and fair treaty, but it's also one that supports United States interest. First time any American president has done anything like that on a world stage. And for that, he will become the first president to win a Nobel Prize for Peace. And now I can get to what I was trying to get to earlier. To project American power show our rising military influence. In December of 1907, TR sent 16 battleships to the United States Navy on a, quote, goodwill tour of the world. I always thought that was a little funny. 16 warships on a goodwill tour. They were painted in their Navy peacetime color, bright white. By the way, it looks very impressive. You don't use that in war. Wartime, you know, like a nice dull gray where it doesn't stick out. But the ships look very impressive. Many of them were actually obsolete, and it wasn't part of Goodwill Tour, but one of the major stops is going to be Japan, and it's kind of to impress Japan with America's military might. I want to point out that the fleet stayed a while in Japan. They were very friendly. Everybody got along great. And the Americans introduced something into Japan that the Japanese ended up loving and have made it their own. Baseball. When we introduced the Japanese to baseball. And they love it almost as much, probably more than we do anymore. It's very big over there. Look at all the Japanese stars that now come over here to play in the major leagues, for example. But I always thought that was a nice little byproduct of the visit, you know, something positive. We weren't really ready for anything like that. The Navy didn't want to do it. Not have the colliers, the coal colliers to supply the ships. We didn't have enough overseas bases. The fleet had to be followed by 38 colliers, coal ships, just to get from Virginia, where the Atlantic Fleet was based, around South America to San Francisco to start the Pacific leg of the voyage. Took 125,000 pounds of coal. It had to be hauled by 38 ships, 30 of which were British. So ironically, the voyage actually paid huge dividends for the Navy, even though they had not wanted to do it. They learned a lot of their faults and inadequacies, and they began to address them. They began to build a worldwide infrastructure for supporting it. And again, that's going to pay dividends in World War I and then later World War II. On the 22nd of February, 1909, the Goodwill Voyage, or it becomes known as the Great White Fleet. The voyage ends. They had made 20 ports of call and stormed, or, God, I can't talk today, steamed 43,000 miles. And as I pointed out, it gave them invaluable experience in planning and logistics. But it also was an announcement that the U.S. was now a major player in the world militarily. And here's the fleet steaming out from its base at Hampton Roads, Virginia. And here's the route. America, San Francisco, so I can't remember, I think it was Seattle. And then across the Pacific, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, to India through the Suez Canal, and then back. Roosevelt, when he was elected in his own right in 1904, had made what he later considered to be a hasty promise that he would not seek re-election. He had served almost all of McKinley's second term and then was elected in his own right. Washington, he would only serve 2 terms. So he doesn't run for re-election in 1908. By the way, had he run for re-election, he'd almost assuredly would have won. He was an extremely popular president. But he doesn't run. Instead, he supports his close friend and hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. Runs as a mild progressive. And he wins in 1908. And who does he defeat?
William Jennings Bryan.
There you go. Third and last time for him. They finally realized he ain't going to win anything. His total of the vote kept going down. That should have been a big hint. He only won 43% of the 43% of the popular vote. Taft wins with 50, and the heaviest president we've had so far. He tipped the scales at 340 pounds. He'd make a nice defensive tackle, wouldn't he? And by the way, it's a myth that he once got stuck in the White House bathtub. That's not true. They did bring in a custom-made bathtub for him, a much larger one for his comfort, but he never got stuck in the old one. And ironically, remember I told you he busted a lot of trusts? One of the ones was the company that built the bathtub. How's that for gratitude? Despite his size, Taft enjoyed playing sports. He was a wrestler. He was an avid golfer, and very good at both, I might add. And a huge baseball fan. Guess what his favorite team was, folks? Cincinnati Reds, yeah. Grew up in Cincinnati back then. Well, even today, you got to be a baseball fan. God. Maybe this year we'll have a team to root for. Maybe. Who knows? And I know the groundhog saw a shadow, or didn't see a shadow, but the real sign that spring is coming, catchers and pitchers report to spring training in 2 weeks. That's a sure sign that summer's finally on its way. He's such a baseball fan that in April of 1910, first game of the season for what was his home team then, the Washington Senators. And back then they had an American League team. Now they have the Nationals, which is a National League team. But Taft threw out the first pitch. He was the first president, in fact, he inaugurated that tradition. And now, I think almost every president does it, whether they like baseball or not. But he was the first one to throw out the first pitch. Took a Cincinnatian to do that. By the way, he threw it to a future Hall of Famer, Walter Freight Train Johnson. Probably never heard of him, but he was one of the greatest pitchers in history. He could throw the ball well over 100 miles 100 years ago, before you had everybody under the sun doing it. Okay, too much baseball, right? Hey, football's over. Here's Taft's boyhood home in the late 19th century, up on Auburn Avenue in Clifton. What's right across the street from it today? Yeah, thank you. Christ Hospital. And here's the home today. The William Howard Taft National Historic Site. Yes, sir.
Was it always that color? Because it has been that color forever.
Actually, that is the right color.
That's what he wanted it to be.
That's what it was when he was a kid, yeah. When I was growing up, and this was a long time ago, they didn't know that. And God, I guess for years, it was painted white. And they were doing restorations, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s, and went back and found out that's the original color. So the house is a lot more historic and accurate than it ever had been. Yeah, it's been like that now for what, 20 years or so, something like that. But that is the original color. Yeah, it's not, I don't particularly like it, do you?
Pretty.
Yeah, it's kind of,
Brown,
you know,
yellow, maybe they wanted to.
that was fashionable back then, strangely enough, yeah.
Gold.
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't paint my house in it. I would paint a doghouse. By the way, here's the bathtub. Rub it up, 4 men in a tub. I told you it was big. Actually, I don't know if it's still there, but that was actually in the annex to the house now. They have a museum next to it. And the tub was on display. I think it's there permanently, but I haven't been back lately. If you ever have a chance to go there, you ought to. It's kind of neat. A lot of Cincinnati history. You learn a lot about how at least the upper middle class lived in Cincinnati back in the mid-19th century. Now, Taft personally was a genuinely nice guy. You can't really say that about a lot of presidents. He was easygoing, had a sense of humor, and this all worked against him in the cruel, cold world of politics. He was extremely efficient, organized, and very intellectual. But he preferred to take his time, deliberate on a problem, and was very slow to act. All these traits made him a very gifted lawyer and a gifted judge, but it doesn't help him as president. He lacks leadership and he lacks decisiveness. He doesn't like to cross people. He doesn't like public arguments. He didn't really want to be president. Mrs. Taft wanted him to be president. What was his dream job? Lifeguard on a beach in Jamaica. No. What was his dream job? Yes, ma'am. Thank you, yeah. That was what he wanted. He wanted to be a justice on the Supreme Court. Does he get his wish? Yeah, he does. He will eventually become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I might add, he is so far, anyway, the only person in American history to hold both positions. The only person to ever have been president and Chief Justice. So eventually he'll get the job he wants. Right now he's got the job Mrs. Taft wanted for him. He ran as a progressive and does share many progressive concerns, but at heart he's a conservative, especially when it comes to business interest. So he's an uneasy progressive. His weak support. The criticism of Teddy Roosevelt and other progressives. In fact, Teddy turns on his old friend and becomes his biggest critic. Part of it had to do with the fact that Taft wasn't the ardent progressive that TR was. The other part of it had to do with the fact that Taft was president and Roosevelt wasn't. Almost immediately after making his pledge not to run for re-election, he regretted it. Remember, he liked being in control, and it frustrated the hell out of him when he wasn't. So no matter what Taft does, it's going to be wrong in TR's eyes. He needs justification for challenging him in 1912 for the Republican nomination. So he turns on his old friend, and it's rather vicious, quite frankly. And typical of Taft, he was hurt. I mean, this really hurt him on a personal level, probably more so than it ever affected TR. So in 1912, Roosevelt challenges Taft for the Republican nomination. Now, the idea of having primaries in the states was just becoming fashionable. Not every state held primaries. In fact, only a handful did back then. And the other thing, they were non-binding. They were sort of more of an opinion poll than a binding vote. Today, if a state in a primary, Democratic or Republican primary, if they vote for a certain candidate, that candidate then gets the delegates from this state. Back then, that wasn't the case. A state could vote in favor of a certain candidate, but the delegates would go to the convention and vote for somebody else. They were not bound by the decision. In the few primaries they had back then, Roosevelt won, and won rather handily in most of them. But as I pointed out, only a few states had them, and they weren't binding. At the Republican convention that year, Taft had the support of the party bureaucracy and the party bosses. And any attempt by Roosevelt to steal away the nomination got squashed. Taft actually got his little bit of revenge. He got the nomination, Roosevelt didn't. And Taft will run again as a moderate progressive. But a lot of the progressives in the Republican Party were disappointed with the convention and the control the conservatives had of the party. So they finally break. In 1912, Roosevelt, Robert La Follette, Gifford Pinchot, remember him, Hiram Johnson of California, they all break from the party and form a new party, a third party, the Progressive Party. And guess who emerges as their candidate? Robert La Follette. Yeah, they initially nominate him, then his health collapses, and immediately they renominate Teddy Roosevelt. So Roosevelt becomes the candidate of the Progressive Party. And almost overnight, they pick up a somewhat unwanted nickname because of Teddy. By the way, this is a temporary photograph of the Progressive Convention in Chicago. By the way, if you're ever on Jeopardy, and the final Jeopardy question is, what American city has hosted the most presidential conventions? It's Chicago, hands down. All right. One thing about the progressives I want to point out, they had women delegates there, including the reformer Jane Addams. She gave Teddy's nominating speech. You didn't see that in either of the other two parties back then. So they were showing their true progressive principles. Roosevelt's out on the campaign trail giving a speech in Milwaukee in October of 1912. And during the speech, a would-be assassin shoots him. Luckily, it was a low-powered pistol from a distance. And Roosevelt, since he liked to talk a lot, he had a big, thick speech. And he had it in his pocket. And lucky for him, the bullet hit the speech. It still gave him a slight flesh wound. He was bleeding, but it was nothing serious. I mean, it could have been a hell of a lot worse, right? Thank God he was long-winded. But he decided to finish the speech even though he was bleeding. He couldn't give up the stage. He was too much a ham, right? So he finishes a 90-minute speech. And to ensure everyone he was all right, and capable of continuing the campaign, he announced, quote, "I'm as healthy as a bull moose." And overnight, the Progressive Party, which had sought for years to gain credibility for their cause, suddenly becomes known as the Bull Moose Party. I guess it could have been worse. It could have been the Bullwinkle Party. But it did give them a campaign mascot. Here it is. The Democrats had their donkey and the Republicans had their elephant. They had their moose. Now, a lot of people thought Roosevelt's intent was controversial. After all, Washington had only served 2 terms, and as this cartoon illustrates, that's Washington condemning a guilty-looking TR for running for a 3rd term. So that's going to work against him. The Democrats that year also nominate a progressive candidate. The governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson. And by the way, within his own party, he had to defeat a progressive challenger, Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House. It took 46 ballots to pick a candidate. So, and the other thing I want to point out, the leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene V. Debs, also throws his hat in the ring. So you've got 2 progressives, a moderate progressive, and a socialist running. One way or the other, you're going to get a reformer in the White House in that election. TR does surprisingly well for a 3rd-party candidate. He does better than Taft does. But with a divided field with 4 candidates, Wilson wins the election with 42% of the popular vote and a whopping 435 electoral votes. Debs actually garnered 1 million votes in the election. So he actually did quite well for what was basically a 4th-party candidate. And here's the election of 1912. And obviously Wilson sweeps the South, but he carries much of the country. Notice TR carries more than Taft. Taft only carries Vermont and Utah. About the worst showing ever for a president seeking re-election or a candidate. TR, like I said, actually did better than Taft did.